And last takeaway, important takeaway, successful pacts have nothing to do with prior secularism, prior Islamism, Islamic tradition or culture, but rather the institutional conditions in which Islamists and secularists engage one another as relative equals. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alaoui. Thank you for introducing your book, sharing with us your opinion, your works. It was very clear, valuable, and I think we agree on the fact that it remains a very complex subject. I think that we can open an exchange, so we can ask your question. Vous pouvez, je pense, poser vos questions en français. If you agree. Thank you. Thank you.
So if you have a question, you can put your hand up, please.
Français ou anglais?
Ce que vous voulez. Ce que vous voulez.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
And thank you for your intervention. It is truly an honor to have you here. We've been talking about secularists, and they often advocate for secularism in the name of democracy. My question is, in your opinion, do you think that we can imagine a true democratical state without any Islamic references in the constitution or even references to Sharia law, with a society that's 99.9% Muslim and that in one way or another have like true attachments to these rules?
Thank you. This book, by the way, and I hope some of you will read it in the context of your, first of all, of your interest, and then also of your work for your formal academic work or beyond. It proceeds as a proof. If a bit like a mathematical proof, if A is true and B is true, then we can deduce C, etc., etc. I say the following in the book, and I've tried to convey that idea, although it doesn't come across very strong. To place as a ceiling or as a criteria the advent of democratization with doing away of religion, I think is very realistic, and it doesn't work. That means that you are going to exclude half of the population of the globe from the criteria or from the right to be considered a democracy simply because they have a different religious experience. So the short question the short answer to your question is no. However, there must be an agreement between all, and that is a little bit what I explain also in the book, and I refer to Alfred Stefan's twin toleration. Has anyone heard of this article he wrote, The Twin Toleration? And that is a very important political science article, and I will urge all of you to read it. It essentially holds the following thesis. If political actors, religious actors, agree that religion can be practiced only, but with the idea that they will not impose it to everyone else, and they will give autonomy to the political sphere. And if, on the other hand, politicians or the secularists accept the existence of religions and do not want to do away with it, then we can agree on how much politics and how much religion and faith remains in the public sphere and how much of it essentially is or retires to the individual and private sphere. And in fact, this is the whole difference between laïcité and secularization. Laïcité is a French term that essentially expels religion from all manifestations in the public sphere and keeps it strictly in the private. Most other countries in Europe are secular, and there is a place of religion in the public sphere. If you see King Charles is a parliamentarian king and operates or reigns within the context of a parliamentary system. His first speech has talked about him being the defender of the faith and of the Anglican Church, but he's also said, the place of the church, I will defend all faiths and the right of all faiths to be expressed. So there's obviously an elaborate process of negotiation, but it can only be done within the context of a clear understanding that neither can do away with the other. Then, where does secularization go? That's another issue.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Alors si vous me permettez, je vais poser la question en français. Alors avant toute chose, merci pour votre présentation. Et je voudrais revenir sur le cas de la Tunisie, et notamment sur le tournant Qais Saïd. Et donc deux questions s'imposent. La première, est-ce que du moins, le tournant qu'a pris la Tunisie aujourd'hui va signer l'arrêt de mort, on va dire, du mouvement Nahda, notamment la contestation populaire.
Oui.
La contestation populaire de ce mouvement en juillet l'année dernière. Et deuxième question, comme vous le savez, il y a les élections législatives en décembre et l'opposition, la majeure partie de l'opposition a décidé de boycotter ces élections. Et moi, la question que je me pose, était-ce la bonne position, c'est-à-dire de sortir du jeu institutionnel pour lutter contre Qais Saïd? Ne serait-il pas meilleur d'investir la scène politique pour pouvoir continuer à pouvoir critiquer cette personne? Je vous remercie.
D'abord, ce n'est pas de Nahda dont il faut s'inquiéter. Est-ce que Nahda va se trouver éliminé ou pas? C'est de la démocratie tunisienne dont il faut s'inquiéter. C'est-à-dire, est-ce qu'elle va pouvoir survivre l'expérience Qais ou pas? Alors, pour ce volet de la question, je pense à la chose suivante. Il y a un problème dans la littérature des sciences politiques et chez les observateurs de manière générale. On voit l'absence de démocratie comme automatiquement voulant dire système autoritaire. Donc, il y a toutes sortes de critères qui sont appliqués à l'étude de la Tunisie, et ça même pas des journalistes ou pas des activistes, et on voit essentiellement que la Tunisie ne remplit plus toutes ces cases, indépendance de la justice, société civile, presse libre, etc. Et on dit automatiquement système autoritaire, donc nous sommes dans une régression. Oui, nous sommes dans une régression, mais l'absence de démocratie ne veut pas automatiquement dire autoritarisme. Et ça, c'est une nuance très importante. Tant qu'il y a l'échafaudage de la démocratie en Tunisie, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a l'infrastructure et qu'on puisse justement appeler au boycott d'élections, ça veut dire que les possibilités pour regagner du terrain et pour réinstaurer la démocratie sont possibles. Et c'est le même exemple partout. Je vous encourage ici à réfléchir de manière transrégionale et transversale. Bolsonaro au Brésil, c'est un peu un Qais en Tunisie. Et ailleurs, partout, on a vu système autoritaire. Eh ben, il a perdu les élections. Non seulement il a perdu les élections, il n'a pas reconnu les élections pendant longtemps. Ce qui veut dire quoi? Ce qui veut dire, moi, pour un observateur de politique, ça veut dire qu'il était en train d'encourager l'armée à intervenir. L'armée n'a pas intervenu. Et c'est ce que je veux dire par l'échafaudage. Tant qu'il y a un échafaudage, les structures sont là, et les structures peuvent reprendre le dessus. Et l'exemple, la Tunisie a des attributs très très encourageants. Dans le sens, il y a une mobilisation, il y a des gens qui comprennent le véritable enjeu, le rejet des jeux élitistes et des jeux un peu incestueux politiquement entre les élites tunisiennes ayant été refutés avec justement l'avènement et avec le vote pour ce nouveau président. Maintenant, c'est déjà dans le passé. On sait d'ores et déjà qu'il faut se mobiliser pour contrer ce nouveau président et pour empêcher que les choses ne se détériorent davantage. Ensuite, vous avez un avantage très 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 important en Tunisie. C'est l'absence de l'armée dans le jeu politique. pour des raisons historiques et aussi pour des raisons institutionnelles, l'armée a finalement gagné de la démocratie. Elle a été reconnue alors qu'à l'époque, elle a été totalement marginalisée et minorée. Et donc, c'est pour moi la raison de croire que la démocratie tunisienne en sortira gagnante. Mais pour revenir au thème de notre discussion d'aujourd'hui, le cas d'avant, étant donné qu'on va renouer, ou que l'on devrait théoriquement renouveler avec une démocratie électorale, c'est-à-dire non consolidée, mais ayant requis les minimums de critères, je ne pense plus que les pactes vont être inopérants aujourd'hui, puisque l'essentiel de ce travail a été déjà fait. Donc on va aller directement à la construction, mais une construction qui est non pactisée.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question, I suppose, regarding the political cleavage that you established between Islam and secular. When we discuss, I suppose, the post-colonial period.
When I what? Excuse me? Could you repeat just the last word?
Yes, like when we discuss the post-colonial period, it seems that though Islam was present in both the rhetoric of Ben Youssef and Bourguiba in Tunisia, it was largely instrumentalized. And so I'm wondering what has happened in this historical moment where we're able to establish a binary cleavage between Islam and secular in Tunisia, when it wasn't so in the 50s and 60s, in the moment of independence.
Well, that's a very interesting. It's a very interesting point. Islamism in Tunisia is, first of all, just about the historical dimension. It is we forget this, but the advent of the post-colonial state in our region is the advent of the advent of the modern state that basically monopolizes the discourse on religion. And it can either throw Islamists in jail through repression, or it can, contrary, give itself the right and the only right to be able to deliberate and to adjudicate on these matters of the religion. So the first Islamist organization in all this era, in all this sphere, is the post-colonial state. So that's something we have to remember. And why that cleavage, it exists in Tunisia, but it doesn't operate in the same way, because Islamism in Tunisia is relatively a newcomer, a latecomer. Islamism in Tunisia doesn't emerge until the early 70s through the movement of the MTI, which is basically the precursor or the predecessor to the Nahdan Ghannouchi. And that's for a simple reason too, is because Bourguiba basically tried to secularize or modernize the state without, in the beginning it was very, a little bit opportunistic on the part of Bourguiba. There's the Bourguiba before, during the struggle for independence, that basically encouraged women to keep the scarf, and people not to take French nationality. And then there is the Bourguiba who later on faces Ben Youssef and faces a candidate or a challenger which wants to see Tunisia anchored to the east, and then endorses a kind of modernizing effort on the part of the state that is egalitarian to a certain degree. It is certainly hegemonic. It is certainly coercive, but it is more egalitarian than elsewhere, and hence everybody felt that they are part of this enterprise, which is very justice-oriented and seen and that changed compared to other places. So that's the reason why Islam comes to the surface in a very different way. And in fact, when I had asked Ghannouchi, he said to me, we are Islamists because we believe this is part of our identity, but we are also very conscious of our Tunisian wealth and our Tunisian repertoire, which part of a national memory. I am attached to the fact that Tunisia has elaborated the 1861 constitution, and as all Tunisians, I think it's part of our national repertoire. And I accept and wholly endorse the Mudawwana of Bourguiba. So Because of that more egalitarian policy, politique of Bourguiba, the Islamist movement was more included within the construction of the modern state and operating within the Jacobin state and tried to be part of it. And when he retreated on these, I asked him, I said, well, but why would you abandon the raison d'etre? He said, because for me, the ummah is not strictly between faithful and non-faithful. For me, the ummah is also a question of preserving life, of preserving the maqasid of Islam, and here Tunisianness is the criteria of part of that ummah. So we have all these sorts of dimensions, the legacies of the past authoritarian state, the trajectory of the Islamist regime, and also the new, the sense of common political culture, which is represented by a national repertoire and not just a collective social system of beliefs.
Yeah, my question pertains to your part on color revolutions, where you sort of go over the causes of color revolutions. And I was just wondering whether you think that foreign attempts at regime change, especially Western attempts at regime change, have a role to play in color revolutions, because even during the Arab Spring, there was this constant rhetoric that people are only rising against the regimes because the West is supporting them. So do you think there's like a balance between the two narratives, or what do you think, especially?
Well, no, I think, are you a political science student? Or just so I know your background, I'd like to recommend a piece called Color Revolution, which is seminal, essentially. It explains this, and it's I think, number 85 in world politics. And that's a very important publication if you read that. Colored revolutions happen for a variety of reasons. First of all, before you have a colored revolution, you have, I've advanced a little generically and I've summarized a little of these arguments, which in a different setting would have required more elaboration and more explanation. Regimes in Eastern Europe, before knowing colored revolution, they've essentially made a stop. They made a stop and occupied as a stopping pause competitive authoritarianism. What is competitive authoritarianism? Competitive authoritarianism is when an autocracy is partly free. It does not exist. Partly democratic does not exist. Either you're democratic or you're not. But an authoritarian regime can be partly free, and it can occupy different grades of that shade, of that autocratic shade in the spectrum. So first, the demise of these single-party systems have given, in some certain instances, political systems dominated by a single, by a dominant party that has been constituted from the remnants of the old regime, remnants of the old Communist Party, and they have been political entrepreneurs that have known how to maintain power. But they have done so through the instauration of competitive authoritarian regimes. And comparative authoritarian regimes can be very stable if they know how to subvert and deflect threats. But at some point, they become essentially, assaulted by all sorts of forces, and they essentially lose. So, ignoring that whole dimension, which is the story of the Ukraine with the Kushma regime, and it's a story also, it's not so much a story of Poland, but it's a story also of Romania, then you begin to understand color revolution, and you see that these are political and social dynamics which can be very well explained, and they have nothing to do with plots from the West or George Soros.
Thank you, sir, for coming here tonight. I would like to elaborate more on this notion of pactism. You've cited 3 examples, Spain, Chile. I would maybe include, I think you cited as well Portugal. But do you think that pactism is a necessity for regimes that are transitioning? Because I think if the cultural framework, if society is ready, if there's an internal push, if internationally the regime is also failing, I think democracy does not need to have this process of pactism to arrive in a country. And I would also like to ask you about whether pactism is good for the...
Whether pact is what?
Pactism is good for this emerging democracy, because, for example, in the case of Chile, in the case of Spain, you have many cases of people that tortured individuals that were very close to the regime, that have never been tried, have never been judged, and still play a role, of course, not nominally, but officially, in the democratic process of the state, if you want, in the institutions of the state. So you think that pactism is really a positive thing, that countries should adopt pactism when transitioning from an autocratic regime to a democracy?
Well, let's be very clear on one thing. There is the original sin in pacting. What Guillermo O'Donnell and what Philip Schmider would have called in their book the original sin. And the original sin here is that we must always keep it in mind, is that this is democracy through undemocratic means, is that the first inaugural step in this democracy process is something undemocratic. It's essentially getting together in closed doors and agreeing on certain principles. But then the contrary to that, or the counterfactual to that, how do you vanquish those 3 criteria I've been talking about, which are extreme polarization, and which are normative diversity, and which are parity? When those all examples here, basically conflict is untractable. You have to get over that obstacle, get over that hump, and it's an enormous hump. But I'll agree with you. I agree with you that pacted democracy has that problem, and as a result of that problem, it sometimes risks being an elite affair in which people are frozen out of a discussion and stay out of a discussion and are not included into the debate. However, Spain has been a pacted democracy and has succeeded. I'm sorry, I mean, it couldn't have done otherwise. In the context of 1975, well, if you can offer me another mode of transition, I would love it. Then the other mode of transition is revolution. Of course, you're going to have revolution. Revolutions work, but it takes 25 years of an authoritarian regime that kills everybody, and that confiscates democracy, and that basically exerts tremendous economic burden on people. And it's the case of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the French Revolution, je sais pas combien d'années de terreur, and who knows, some regimes can fall, and at the end of the day require revolutions to correct, but it's a question of path of minimum of optimal cost. Now, there is an important issue also, and that needs to be clarified, and that is pacted transitions do not necessarily equate a lack of catharticism, a lack of can I say accountability as far as the crimes of the past. That is only the case of Brazil and Spain, but other pacted transitions have known instances of truth and reconciliation committees and efforts that have led basically to knowing everything that has passed. And I think we talked about Latin America, and we talked about South Africa, and South Africa is one of those instances, and it was been led by Desmond Tutu. So do not conflate the two. Now, finally, and very importantly, this question of a pact sheltering past actors and to a degree permitting them to somehow stay in the shadows, to come back and to reimpose themselves in politics, is an interesting, very interesting question. And I wonder to what degree the fact that the Brazilian society has not known the extent of the past abuses of the regime, and some of the actors have persisted and have survived that whole cataclysm. I wonder to what degree they have managed to emerge in the process of Bolsonaro. I wonder whether Bolsonaro would have essentially existed without sheltering and without protecting those old enclaves. That's an open question for me, and I'm not still perfectly resolved on that.
Hi, my name is Karina. Thank you so much for coming all the way down here. I don't think it's a very convenient location for anyone to be coming to. I just have 3 brief questions. First of all, you mentioned over here institutional conditions, and it seems to be part of a broad trend in current academic literature, which
in what?
A broad trend in academic literature, especially developmental literature, that attributes, the development of economies to institutions. And I was wondering, when you say that it has nothing to do with culture or with a sort of traditional history, can we really separate institutional conditions from this? In fact, ought we isolate them in this manner? My second question would be that you seem to imply that pacting should be seen as a healthy feature and not a bug of democratization, and that we ought to be ecstatic, in fact, when we see successful instances of pacting, for example, in Tunisia. Then would you go as far as to say that a sort of competitive consortialism is the destiny of these countries? For example, we're going to see an entrenched multi-partyism in regimes like Tunisia. And finally, would you consider Tunisia to be an exception? For example, last year I think I read a book called Tunisia, the Arab Anomaly. Would you say that there is such a thing as even a Tunisian model, or we ought to aspire for a Tunisian model? And if so, and if not, would you say that there is something transferable to other Arab states? Thank you.
Yeah. It's a long list of questions, but remember, when I talked about the criteria, I said about the criteria, and I was very, very clear on this, and I believe on this same slide. Let me go to it. Here they are. These are, thank you. Recevoir une raclée. Non, voilà. Alors, I said these are background conditions. These are criteria for pacting. They do not determine the success or the failure, the chances of success or failure of a transition. They are only the conditions which induce to pacting. And paradoxically, the more powerful you can have a situation where you have very high marks on all of these, so the inducement for pacting is very high, but at the same time you can have background conditions which are very disfavorable and still have a transition that fails. So I just want you to understand that it's a tricky nuance there, a distinction between what initiates a pacting process and what makes a transition succeed. Now, as far as developmentalism, yes, I agree. Adam Przewalski wrote very, very eloquently and very persuasively on this business of development. The more beyond a certain threshold, and he's tabulated that marvelously, statistically, beyond the very threshold, you see that a return to authoritarian rule is very unlikely. But then again, nothing is cast in stone. This is not an exact science. This is just correlation and the stuff with Gini parameters, Gini variables, and regressions, and coefficients and so forth. So you can run these regressions and know. Pacting is not healthy. I do not wish to imply that it's healthy. It's very unhealthy, frankly, because it means democracy through undemocratic means. But sometimes it's the only thing. Well, what do we do in the context of an uprising if the conditions are there for pacting, we let the transition go on until someone wins. What does that mean, that someone wins? It can mean civil war. It can mean, in our region, the Algerian specter. If Ghannouchi did not pact with his secularist counterparts, it wouldn't have meant the army would step in, but it would certainly meant that the Ministry of Interior and the police would have stepped in. I have no question, no doubts about it. And more importantly than me, he didn't have any doubts about it, or the people that entered into the pact, whether him or the security services know. Now, finally, this whole business about culture, and you're absolutely right. When I studied culture, I was your age or maybe a bit older, and my graduate student. Culture it's important, you know, where a country comes from, what are the forces, what distinguishes it from other. The anthropology is very extremely important. The problem with culture is that it becomes a kind of black box in which you throw everything in. Culture, oh, that is culture, this is culture. And that is very disturbing for me, because it's a magma of material that I cannot discern. But what I felt helpful in all these countries is that Tunisians didn't talk to me about culture. They talked to me about répertoire. They said to me, this is un répertoire dans la mémoire collective. When Ghannouchi told me 1861 is something important for us, and the Mudawana is something important for us. And it brings the whole idea, and I think I quote the book you talked to me about, the Tunisian exceptionalism. No, I don't believe in exceptionalism anywhere in this region. I believe in advantages. There is a Tunisian advantage, in the same way there can be, in certain instances, a monarchical advantage. I believe in that term. There are structures, and there's a whole passage that can induce certain processes to go further more easily than others. But there's no such thing as an exception. At the end of the day, this is about agency. It can be about path dependency, about certain structural variables, but it also means about agency, how people can bargain and deal with. After all, the Tunisian Islamists were more brutalized by the Ben Ali regime than the Muslim fundamentalists were brutalized by the Mubarak regime, or by any regime in Egypt. Yet the Muslim Brotherhood played a game of we'll do it alone, while the Tunisians, on the contrary, gave their hand and leaned forward to embrace their other colleagues and challengers.
So I had two questions. Both of them are about Qais Said. I'm not sure if they've already been asked in French or not, but I'll state them. So when we look at Tunisia today and its new constitution, which mentions Islam and the Islamic Ummah, do you think it's a process of compromise with Ennahda, or rather a reflection of the independent president? And my second question is, there's often this popular notion, usually perpetrated by outside actors, that Qais Said is taking Tunisia backwards by breaking certain elements in democracies through decrees and other measures. He still remains very popular with the people, especially when he's ruling in these decrees and the measures that he's taking. So in essence, is Qais Said's actions, are they taking Tunisia a step backwards or forward?
He's not taking Tunisia forward, not at all. Okay? Confiscating spaces of freedom and of democratic governance is not taking the country forwards. It is essentially confiscating those in the name of a dubious political dubious political project that has shown its limits and essentially shown its true nature in other parts of the world. There's populism, and we've seen it before. You can call it Caesarism, call it whatever you call it. It's essentially a charismatic ruler. In this case, I fail to see the charisma, frankly, but it's a charismatic ruler that incites, the fears of people, the anger and the resentment of people, basically to centralize power in the name of a project, in the name of a complicity between leadership and the people, and essentially replicates an authoritarian regime which only creates more problems. And the result is clear. The result is clear. Just look at the latest IMF package and the IMF negotiations with Tunisia. It's anything but a blank check. It's anything but an endorsement of his governance and the confidence the international community or the business community or the economic power holders in the world give his style of government. But again, in these things, as I was saying earlier, you never take a country backwards. You don't take it forwards, but there's never a return to the past. It's always, going either right to the right hand or to the left. It's going someplace, but certainly not. It's certainly not the past. A lot of this populism, in the world, and this is important to say. Maybe it's the moment to say it here. In the entire Arab world, the only country that could have become populist is Tunisia, paradoxically or interestingly. Why? Because, first of all, you needed an electoral democracy to usher in populism. No other regime in the area can be populist. No other regime in the area can tell the people, you and I are gonna partner together against the corrupt politicians and the corrupt elites, whether in business circles or business elites or political elites, for the simple reason that these regimes have been governing for so long that they can't turn around and disavow themselves. So just in that sense, it's a proof that Tunisia has moved forward in showing an anomaly or a pathology, an autocratic pathology that is much different than any other reason. So it's in a bizarre way a forward-moving movement, and at the same time, I doubt that he can perpetuate his rule indefinitely. Yeah, but it will run its cycle, and at some point there will be mobilization. There will be enough sectors of the Tunisian society that coalesce against him and wanting to restore or return to the democratic process. But as you're right, you need a critical mass, and maybe that critical mass is not there.
Should I go? Yeah. Hello, and thank you for your talk. It was very insightful. I'm wondering if this concept of pactism, if we apply it in the Islamic world and in those Arab countries, don't you think that it is limited by the fact that there is a sort of propensity to between the Islamists and the more progressive parts of this pact to go further towards more liberal and progressist reforms in the long term? I mean, for example, let's take the example of abortion or of LGBTQ rights. In those countries, since the actual situation is that there is not a recognition of those rights, in the long term, the only possible result of this pactism would be an ending with the recognition of those actual rights. I don't know if you understood my point.
I understood you perfectly, and it's extremely well taken. And
okay, thank you.
You're absolutely right. This is an entry point for an electoral democracy. It is not consolidated democracy. So it's not, when we talk about electoral democracy, then I'll have to put you into the indexes. That means that still you do not have elements of liberal democracy which have taken root. It's only electoral in the sense that there are rotations of power and the rule of law is accepted, but still it's not enough. So this is an entry point. And let me just show you the last slide, which I never intended to show you, but again, since you're also intelligent at ScPo, you've taken me to this. Now, I've discovered after writing this book I've discovered that at the end of the day, there's another takeaway. Remember my takeaway before? I did this. I showed you my takeaway, and my last takeaway was that. Well, there's another takeaway which precisely links up to your question, and that is about theological production. Meaning, after all this is finished, like in the case of Tunisia, let's not forget this, certain Tunisian laws have been enacted in which certain families can ensure that same inheritance rights are between female and male offspring. That is an enormous theological change. There's an article in the Constitution, I believe, about freedom, la liberté de conscience. That is unthinkable. That goes towards towards precisely a liberal democracy. Now, after the conclusion I wanted to tell you, the other takeaway is that at the end of the day, after all this change and after imposing on the rank and file of the Islamist sectors in society, or rather the political parties in society, then you have to be congruent, which means you have to go back to your theology and produce theological concepts that are in tune with the position that you've taken during the pacting process. And here's an example. Tunisia's Ennahda justified separating its spiritual wing from its political party with doctrinal revision, takhassus, specialization for sake of advancing akhlaq, morals. In other words, the party has separated from its da'wah wing. It's not only part of the party. That is an enormous theological, how can I say, artifice théologique, which goes in the direction you have taken. Instead of governing through la contrainte, through constraint, you govern through hidayah. It's still using Islamic terms, but it's still a movement forward towards the secular society you wish for. Now, what I want to underline in this is that pacting is the entry point to exit authoritarian rule. Then there is the whole concept of finding an equilibrium, finding a contract, finding a mode of coexistence between faith and secularism. And that depends, of course, on the history of every country, and it depends also on how political life is conducted. Now, many of these Islamists, as your colleague said, will Nahda return back to business? We don't know. Will the PJD return back to business in Morocco if there is a political transition? Will it be? No. But there are enough conservative sectors within society that want faith to play a role in public life, that at the end of the day, someone has to occupy that pole, and someone has to represent that pole, and someone has to enact or has to give a mandate to that pole in politics. And that's talking about the future of Islamism in the region that I don't know. But religion will always have a place in the future of this region in the future. Now, I can very well, or someone else can very well say, well, you know, you want rights for this or that group, but that doesn't conform with my own vision of society. Then what do we do? I'm all for it. I'm for people choosing their whole life and living their lives as they want. But that represents me. It doesn't, like you, we represent each other, we represent ourselves. But at the end of the day, the interaction between these two forces is going to happen once we exit the autocracy and we lay down the foundations of an institutional framework that can work for our parts of society, and then we can deliberate. Ireland was there before, where abortion was impossible to envision. Poland was there. I mean, this is 20 years back. So it is not science fiction. It is a trajectory. It is a march forward that Tunisians, Moroccans, Algerians, and will have to deliberate and will have to work together to get there. Oh, you guys
Thank
are
you.
really sharp for undergraduates.
Alors, je me revoilà. Donc,
Vous revoilà.
non,
Comme Renouchi.
comment exact. Quand on le croit partir, il revient
Oui,
toujours.
Oui, exactement. Oui.
Donc, si vous me permettez, je voudrais élargir le spectre comparatif que vous avez
Bien sûr.
débuté dans le cadre de la comparaison des
Bien
démocraties pactisées.
Oui.
Et je voudrais, du moins, quand on étudie l'index de démocratie
Oui.
dans le monde arabe,
Oui.
précisément au Maghreb, on se rend compte que la Tunisie recule.
Oui.
Et qu'il y a un tournant autoritaire qui est en train d'être pris. Et que la Tunisie se rapprocherait du niveau de démocratie que le Maroc a aujourd'hui.
Oui.
Et donc, pouvons-nous considérer que, alors que durant ces 10 dernières années, la Tunisie a été considérée comme le fer de lance de la démocratie,
oui.
est-ce que cette place n'est pas aujourd'hui prise par le Maroc, qui lui entame petit à petit une démocratisation en suivant des réformes, contrairement à la Tunisie qui, elle, recule?
Est-ce que vous me posez une question poliment sur le Maroc ou est-ce que vous posez une question sur la Tunisie?
Sur les deux, sur
Non.
le comparatif entre les deux.
Si vous voulez me poser, je vais vous donner un conseil. Vous êtes jeune, c'est très intelligent, c'est très bien fait. Mais si vous voulez poser une question, la jugulaire, elle est là. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez du Maroc? Est-ce qu'il a dépassé la Tunisie? Est-ce qu'il recule? Je n'ai pas vu les indicateurs de la Tunisie et sur quels critères reculera-t-elle ou sur quels critères le Maroc avance. Ça, ce sont des données hautement techniques. Généralement, il faut faire attention aux cases qui tout simplement disent non démocratique, donc autoritaire. Donc j'ai essayé de le dire. Maintenant, si vous posez votre question pour le Maroc reste un pays qui est dans un contexte d'une monarchie traditionnelle. Elle est sur le papier et concernant beaucoup d'analyses juridico-légales, une monarchie absolue. Cela ne veut pas dire que c'est un système politique fermé. Non, il est ouvert. Il est plus ouvert. Maintenant, pour comparer les deux techniquement, vous me demandez une question technocratique. Ça veut dire combien de manifestations on empêche au Maroc, combien de manifestations on empêche en Tunisie, et tirer un trait entre les deux. Est-ce que le système marocain avance vers une démocratisation? Sûrement, s'il aboutit vers une démocratisation, ça sera sûrement à un moment donné ou une autre à cause d'un élément de rupture. Je ne peux pas vous dire quel va être cet élément de rupture, dans quel contexte va-t-il se constituer, est-ce que ça va être économique, est-ce que ça va être social, je ne peux pas vous dire. Ce que je peux vous dire aussi, c'est qu'il est très difficile de comparer les deux, sinon on risque de tomber dans des choses technocratiques. Est-ce qu'il faudrait voir combien de journaux ont été interdits en Tunisie, est-ce que des journalistes ont été mis en prison, et de l'autre côté, voir la même chose pour avoir rattraper la Tunisie, c'est encore avoir un préjugé, de dire voilà la trajectoire de chacun, où se trouve l'un, où se trouve l'autre. Tout ce que je peux dire, c'est la Tunisie est un pays qui a connu une transition, qui connaît une régression, mais qui est une régression dans les espaces. Le président essaye de le refermer, mais il ne peut pas les confisquer. Il y a une masse critique, il ne pourra pas le faire. D'autant plus que je ne vois pas de manne géopolitique. Je ne vois pas de vecteurs géopolitiques qui viennent l'aider, contrairement à l'Égypte. Je peux me tromper. Ça peut rentrer en ligne après, mais je peux me tromper. Le Maroc, quant à lui, a connu une libéralisation plus ou moins accrue. Elle a connu des soubresauts, elle connaît des moments de recul et d'avance, comme le pendule. Et malheureusement, force de constater qu'il y a un moment aujourd'hui où l'État est plus intolérant à l'égard de la liberté d'expression et à l'égard de certaines choses et semble avoir donné la priorité au développement économique. Donc, il faut bien comparer et réfléchir de manière transrégionale, mais il faut faire attention de ne pas tomber dans les définitions technocratiques. Non, on ne recule jamais dans ce genre de choses. On ne revient pas en avant, on ne revient pas en arrière. On peut se perdre à gauche, on peut se perdre à droite, mais on ne recule pas, le train de l'histoire avance. On peut suspendre, geler un petit peu les progrès, mais au final, les vraies questions se posent. Et les vraies questions en Tunisie sont les suivantes. Monsieur le président n'a pas les moyens de sa politique. Il ne peut pas tout simplement scotcher la bouche de tous les Tunisiens et il ne peut pas aussi empêcher que le pays n'aille à l'abîme économique. Il n'y a pas que moi qui le dis, c'est le FMI, la Banque mondiale, c'est tous les bailleurs de fonds qui le disent. Madame? Oh, non, 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 une seconde s'il vous plaît. Si vous, oui.
Moi, j'ai fait Sciences Po à Aix-en-Provence. Je suis avec beaucoup d'intérêt donc votre exposé. Je me demande pourquoi vous avez laissé.
Oui.
D'accord. Pourtant, je la vois forte, non?
Parce que sinon, on n'entendra pas pour l'enregistrer.
Voilà, je me demandais si volontairement vous avez mis de côté la Turquie.
La Turquie? Ah, la Turquie. D'abord, c'était formellement le monde arabe, c'est pas MENA, et donc la Turquie ne fait pas partie. Ensuite, c'est deux pays que je connais plus ou moins, que j'avais pouvoir connaître. En fait, mais voilà pourquoi. Et puis je voulais bien une étude en ricochet, une fine grain, un espèce de face à face. Et concernant la Turquie, la Turquie connaît aussi un moment de populisme dans la politique d'Erdogan. Il a essentiellement utilisé le playbook qu'utilisent tous ces populistes, avec beaucoup de brio d'ailleurs. C'est pas prendre... ça, c'est un argumentaire pour une démocratisation pactée. Ce n'est pas nécessairement un plaidoyer. It's not aspirational. C'est pas aspirationnel, c'est plus technique. Et donc, Erdogan se retrouve comme un populiste classique, et lui, il va un peu plus loin que les autres populistes. Et plutôt se retrouve dans la catégorie de Poutine, où il dit, c'est pas seulement le problème, c'est les élites corrompues, c'est les élites corrompues. Dans ce cas-là, c'est pas seulement les oligarques du kémaliste, comme dirait Poutine, des oligarques de Yeltsin, mais c'est aussi la grandeur de l'Empire ottoman. C'est la grandeur et notre place de l'histoire. Et l'histoire, c'est l'islam qui fait partie, c'est regarder à l'est, regarder à l'ouest, et puis ne pas se faire marcher sur les pieds. Et c'est un peu ce que Poutine fait regardant vers le tsarisme, mais tous jouent un peu dans le répertoire populiste avec brio. Le problème de tous ces partis, de tous ces systèmes autoritaires, c'est que après 10 ans au pouvoir, vous devenez un monarque et pas seulement un président. Et quand vous êtes un monarque, vous vous entourez de courtisans et de laquais. Et finalement, vous voulez que tout le monde autour de vous soit une caisse de résonance de ce que vous voulez entendre. Vous n'avez jamais les bons rapports et jamais personne ne va vous contredire parce qu'on vous dit seulement ce que vous voulez entendre. Et c'est le piège classique dans lequel est tombé Poutine. C'est un peu le piège dans lequel va tomber Erdogan. Et c'est le piège dans lequel va tomber le président chinois qui s'est intronisé aujourd'hui en empereur. Et nous verrons certainement pas la croissance de la Chine, mais on verra ça comme un moment brejnevien. Et donc plus l'auréole du passé est pesante, plus cette dérive est plus dangereuse qu'ailleurs. Kais peut être autiste, au pire. Erdogan peut être à ce moment-là totalement insensible, justement à cause de ce phénomène autoritaire, ce phénomène de devenir monarque.
Merci beaucoup.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to make it short and efficient. Now that this conference is coming to an end, I would like first and foremost to thank Moulay Hicham Alaoui for accepting to come here today. Thank you so much. Just like the book, this conference offered us an interesting analysis of how a democratic pact could work in the MENA region, despite the religious factor that is often perceived as something that prevents the democratization of the region. Indeed, as we saw in courses at ScPo, the question of how democracy might emerge in the Middle East and the Muslim world in general as a whole is a puzzling question, and when studying this topic, one can clearly notice the complexity and the nuance of it. Thank you again, Moulay Hicham Alaoui, for coming. It was a pleasure and an honor to welcome you with us on campus today. Thank you for the participants and everyone in this amphitheater for attending this conference. I am sure that we all learned valuable insights from it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience, and you've pushed me hard. Thank you. Thank you very much. Merci. Hmm?